One of the most surprising patterns found in nature is that as you look at more and more complex creatures, they tend to get less and less coherent. Don't exaggerate the extent of human incoherence. Nevertheless, it is true that there are hundreds of kinds of systematic incoherence that have been found in humans. In the smartest non-human animals, primates, starlings, pigeons, we can arguably find a couple of human forms of incoherence. About as low down as rats, we get credible allegations of incoherence, but you get a paper in a very fancy journal like Science or Nature every time you find it. Go down a little further, something like earthworms. I don't know any credible allegations of incoherence in earthworms. There are some that might work in bees, but nothing lower than that. And there's an entire paper, if you like plant cognition, that's crowing about the fact that nobody's ever seen an incoherent plant. This is puzzling. It's puzzling because you'd think that creatures with more complex resources could use those resources to be more rather than less coherent. And it's especially puzzling if you think that coherence is a correct account of rationality, because then you have that humans are the least rational creatures on Earth, primates are the second least rational creatures on Earth, and the very most rational creature on Earth is not even my dog, it's my houseplant. So this kind of a pattern is something that people know about. You'll see it often mentioned, but you won't see often explanations of this pattern. For example, Alison Gopnik says, why are grown-ups so stupid about probabilities when even babies and chimps can be so smart? She studies children. She says, look, kids do fine with probability. Why are grown-ups struggling? But she just says it. She doesn't give us here an explanation for the trade-off. I take it that there's a fairly natural proposal to make here, namely that humans are bounded agents, we've got scarce cognitive resources, and a defining feature of scarcity is trade-offs. Most famously, there's an accuracy effort trade-off, often, not always, but often. If you want more accurate judgments or higher quality decisions, then in expectation, you're going to have to put in more effort to get those judgments and decisions. Likewise, there's a bias variance trade-off. So, for example, the mean squared error of a predictor just decomposes into the sum of the bias and variance. Bias really hurts, it gets squared, but variance drives error too. So, for a fixed level of error, if you want to drive down bias, you got to drive up variance, drive down variance, you got to drive up bias. There's just no way to avoid trading these things off. So this is what computer scientists do when they're thinking about regularization, is trying to figure out how to trade off bias and variance in learning methods. I've argued before that take two things philosophers care about, accuracy and coherence, that these can trade off. Sometimes if you want to be accurate, it's better to accept the small risk of incoherence, and maybe that's okay, maybe that's not. Here, I want to argue that we also have a trade-off between coherence and cognitive complexity. You get less coherent as you get more and more complex, because it's harder and harder to balance complex forms of cognitive processing with the desire to make them all cohere with each other. This has been suggested, well, I'm suggesting it here. The only paper-length defense I know of this idea is Keith Stanovich, and I want to go a little bit differently than the way that Stanovich explains this trade-off. So in particular, I want to do three things. First is just clarificatory. What do I mean by talking about a complexity coherence trade-off? These clarifications are going to matter. Second is explanatory. I want to say, why does this trade-off tend to arise? And I'll give you, I think we'll have time for three factors that drive the trade-off, and I'll give you kind of a story about how the factors drive the trade-off, and then I'll give you an illustration. And then I'll draw some descriptive and normative implications of this discussion. All right, clarifications first. The fundamental turn in the study of bounded rationality is the turn from substantive to procedural rationality, i.e. study processes first, not attitudes first. So the trade-off's got to be at the level of processes. You got some processes that are available to you. You got some that are more complex, some that are more coherent. Now, complexity is a fact about processes. Coherence is not a fact about processes. It's a fact about the expected coherence of the attitudes they produce. The statement here is, look, you take the most coherent processes, you take the ones that produce the expectedly, the most complex processes and the ones that produce the most expectedly coherent results, and they're not going to be the same processes. Like all the trade-offs we gave above, these are things that happen often, not always. Accuracy effort trade-off doesn't always happen. That's less is more effects. Bias variance, arguably always, but just about everything else. There are exceptions. So how do we argue for a trade-off? It's the same way we understand the trade-off. Namely, we try to say, what are the factors that drive the trade-off? And how do they drive the trade-off? So we'll understand what to look for to determine when the trade-off is present and how strong it might be. We also have to restrict to a range of feasible strategies. It might be that there's some strategies that are so complex we couldn't feasibly use them, but they're in fact very complex and very coherent. So in pairwise choice, you could just list all the things you're choosing between, and one at a time you would rank order them. This is my first, this is my second, this is my third, and that's of course perfectly coherent. It's also a major pain. So the point is, within a range of feasible strategies that bounded agents can reasonably implement, within this range, we'll have a trade-off between complexity and coherence. And if we jump outside the range, maybe we have a trade-off, maybe we don't, but we can't jump outside of that range. What do I mean by complexity? What I mean by coherence? This is a problem. Everybody means different things by coherence. Everybody means what they learned to say in graduate school and thinks that this and only this is right. This can't be true because we all learn different things in graduate school. So some people think about coherence as like logical or probabilistic coherent consistency. A lot of philosophers think about it as structural rationality, which is probably a little bit broader. A lot of the people I talk to think about axiomatic rationality, think about like axiomatic approaches to rational preference in economics. I like to frame it in terms of the standard picture. If you know what this is, or if you read my book, this is the way I put it. If not, just ignore that. So what do I do? Everybody means different things by coherence, but there's more or less a common core. So most people think transitivity is a requirement of consistency and structural rationality and axiomatic rationality, and so on for things like asymmetry of strict preference or independence of irrelevant alternatives. So I'll just try to give you examples that I think are common to most or all these notions of coherence. And just in case they're not, I'll use a couple of different requirements to make sure I hit one. Complexity is going to be a little bit harder. So there's a fight across fields. The complex systems theory folks think about like the Santa Fe folks think, they've got the right lens on complexity. The information theorists think like Shannon entropy, think they've got the right lens on complexity. Behavioral economists have a couple of different lenses. So we'll talk about one in terms of finite automaton theory and the number of states an automaton has, but there's also game theoretic things like level K reasoning. And so there's a lot of variation across fields in how we think about complexity. But also, even if you zoom in on a field, there are ongoing intractable debates. So I told you about Shannon entropy, but some people think, no, there's this other thing called Kolmogorov complexity that's the right way to measure complexity in information theory or logical depth and so on and so forth. This is problematic here because, of course, these people substantively disagree. There's not always a common core. Actually, I probably could have found a common core, but I'm going to go a different way here. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to give you 3 different complexity notions across my 3 different examples, and I'm going to show you, look, with all 3 of these complexity notions, we get a trade-off. And the intended thought is if you named a 4th complexity notion and you asked me to find a trade-off, that hopefully I'd be able to find it. All right, so those are clarifications. Let's get into the talk itself. The first kind of complexity I want to talk about is procedural complexity, how many and how complex the processing steps are. So intuitively, this is going to get you, more complexity, but also less coherence because these steps can get out of whack with each other. Whereas if you only got 1 or 2 steps, they're going to cohere much better. So that's how, increasing the complexity of a process is going to tend to get you more complexity and less coherence. Maybe just reusing an example from an earlier paper that I wrote out of laziness. imagine you're buying a car. I did this last year. One way you could do this is you choose lexicographically. You have some kind of options you're deciding between, car one in the lot, car two in the lot. Let's assume there are M cars in the lot, and those are my options. And options have features, automatic or manual transmission, price, safety rating, the features that I care about. And let's say that they're rank ordered by how much I care about them. I care most about transmission type, and then about price, and then about safety rating. And for every feature, we've got to cardinalize it enough to say, what's better or worse along this feature. So automatic manual can just be a 0, 1 function, automatic's value 1, manual's value 0. Price, anything that treats lower prices as better is fine. Star rating of safety, anything that treats higher stars as better is fine. There are plenty of options here. Just, get something that cardinalizes in the right way. So with lexicographic choice, well, you look at the first feature, transmission type, you maximize value there, i.e. you pick an automatic. Of course, there might be a couple of automatics in the chart lot, so you eliminate all the options that maximize that value function. You go down to the next feature, price, you maximize price, and only if there's a tie do you keep going. This is not always a bad way to make decisions. It's got a pretty big drawback, namely trade-off insensitivity. I'm always going to buy the cheapest automatic car. And if you say, David, there's this other car, it's $5 more expensive, but it's got a lot better safety rating and a lot better tires and a lot better interior and a lot better gas mileage, none of this is able to trade off because these are all lower Qs. And more generally, we can't trade off lower Qs against higher Qs. One thing you might do if you've got a little bit more cognitive resources to spare is to go semi-lexicographic. You'd ignore small differences. So, on each value function, you'll say, what is a small difference in transmission type? I'm not gonna count anything as small there. A small difference in price, maybe $1,000. A small difference in safety rating, maybe 1 star. And anything within a small difference of the best option doesn't get eliminated. That's fine. We'll keep going and break the tie. That's going to let us have trade-offs when it's close. So, if the price difference is within $1,000, I can keep shopping. But if the price difference is more than that, I won't. Problem, of course, is we're going to have a transitivity issue. So transitivity of strict preference. If I prefer car O to car O prime strictly, and I prefer O prime strictly to O double prime, then I better really prefer O to O double prime because, it's better than O, and that's better than O W prime. Double prime, excuse me. Problem is you're not going to have that. So let's imagine we got 3 cars. They're all automatic, so I just hid, the first feature. Next, we look at cost. Car A costs 19 grand. It's got a really good safety rating, 4 stars. Car B costs 18.6, but it's only got 2.5 stars of safety. Car C's got 17.8 thousand as the price tag, but it's got a 1 star safety rating. And remember, we're ignoring differences of up to 1,000 in cost and up to 1 in stars. So just do kind of a standard revealed preference thing. Car A versus car B, if you had to pick. Well, the cost is within a just noticeable difference, so you decide on safety rating and you pick A. Between B and C, the cost is within a just noticeable difference, so you decide on safety rating and you pick B. But between A and C, the cost difference is too big, so you pick C. That looks like a revealed preference A over B, B over C. Transitivity says A over C, but we actually had C over A, and that's a transitivity violation. This is a strict decrease in incoherence. So we just saw one way that semi-lexicographic choice is incoherent, but lexicographic isn't. You can prove pretty easily that lexicographic is transitive. It's just write down what it would mean, and you've basically written the proof. And of course, lexicographic choice can't be any worse in some respect that semi-lexicographic choice is, because it's just a special case where the differences are small enough they don't matter. So lexicographic choice, a little less complex, a little more coherent than semi-lexicographic. And so the thought here is we've got a trade-off between complexity and coherence. We're looking again at procedural complexity. How many processing steps do we need to use and how complex are they? And very, very, very plausibly, semi-lexicographic choice is more procedurally complex than lexicographic, because you just take lexicographic choice and you say, okay, I'm going to do everything a lexicographic chooser would do, except sometimes I'm going to do some extra tie-breaking steps. And I've just literally extended the process with some extra potential steps. Okay, so, if you're choosing among a range of feasible strategies, let's say you can only do lexicographic, semi-lexicographic. One of them is more coherent, the other's more complex, and that's how you get a trade-off. And then more generally, this was just our story. Look, you make a process more complex. That gives it more moving parts, like, say, the choice rule and the tie-breaking rule, and these can conflict. You take away one of the moving parts, you just go lexicographic. Now there's no conflict, and that's how we get a trade-off. The second example is going to be a little more involved. And I'm initially going to give you an interpretation in terms of state complexity, how many different mental states can a being be in, but I'm actually going to reinterpret it in terms of aspiration adaptation as a kind of learning. So maybe we'll get back to exactly what's driving this trade-off at the end of the section. I'm going to pick a particular cognitive architecture here, and this is obviously a pretty simple kind of a cognitive architecture. It's not meant to be a model of human cognition, but it's meant to illustrate the kind of a trade-off you can get with more complex mental states or with imperfect forms of learning. We're looking at finite automata. So finite automata are things, you give them a list, think like, a ticker tape for a Turing machine. It's just you can only go forwards in the ticker tape, never back. So you got a list of things from some domain, and, a list is just an ordered list. You got to pick which one from the list you want to choose. So maybe I'm going to give you an ordered list of cars, and you got to say, David, which car, do I want? A little more formally, you got a machine. It's got some states, and it's a finite automaton, so it's got finitely many states it could be in. One of them, call it S0, is the one it starts in. And then what do we need to know? Well, we need to know how it moves between states. That's a transition function. And we need to know how it makes choices when it finally halts, and that's the output function. So the transition function, right now, you're in some state, you know that. You're looking at some element of the state of the tape, or the list, you know that, but you don't have any memory. Based on your current state and the thing from the list you're looking at, you got to shift to a new state. Could be the same state, could be a different state, or you got to stop. And I'm going to treat this as a non-state. You could treat it as a state. It's just, formally different ways of doing it. And when you finally do stop, you got to make a choice. Again, you know what state you're in, and you know what you were looking at when you stopped. And you got to pick something from the list, is what the output function does. So, for example, here's a one-state automaton. This is going to be a satisficing agent. So we've got a domain with 4 elements. Let's order them, say, in order of increasing utility, and scale it to natural numbers. So one of them has utility 1, utility 2, utility 3, utility 4. This little guy is a satisficer with threshold anywhere strictly between 2 and 3. So what does he do? He starts in the state Q0. Sorry, I stole this diagram from Salient, and he uses slightly different notation. I'd call this S0. He starts in state Q0. Transition functions to arrows. It says if you see a 1 or a 2, that's below my threshold. So go back to the state you were in. You see a 3 or a 4, you halt. And when you halt, what do? Well, if you halt looking at a 3, you pick a 3. You halt looking at a 4, pick a 4. That's satisficing with, say threshold 2.5. The idea here, of course, is you've got cognitive processes, and we're going to study cognitive processes as choice functions. So satisficing as a choice function takes lists and it picks out the choice. And the way to study satisficing as a cognitive thing, something I do, is to study the function on lists that it induces. And we're going to study automaton implementations of choice functions. So what do I mean by an automaton implementing a choice function? I just mean it always spits out the same thing as the choice function. So this implements, satisficing with threshold 2.5, because it always spits out the exact same thing as satisficing with threshold 2.5. Right, so if we do this, we can study, at least within this architecture, quite precisely the complexity of a cognitive process. Right, because we study the complexity of the choice function it implements, and study that by studying the complexity of an automaton. two leading candidates here for complexity notions. A lot of people like state complexity is what I'm going to look at is just how many states do you need to implement the choice function in a finite automaton. So satisfying state complexity, one, you just need one state. You can also look at transition complexity. How many arrows do you have to draw to represent the transition function? And notice this is actually a transition complexity 2 function. But I'm going to stick with state complexity. And in this sense, a satisficing is the minimum possible complexity you can have. You only need one state, and that's as low as you can go. Utility maximization is about as high as you can go. If you got D things in the domain, say 10,000, you need D minus 1, i.e. 9,999 states to represent expected utility maximization. Let me zoom in a little bit. So here's one way to do it. Naturally, you can prove there's no easier way to do it. Basically, you got, D things in the domain. You're going to use states to say the best thing I've seen is, the 0th element or the first element or the second or the first. Sorry, though. No, I'll start with 1. Best thing I've seen is a 1. Best thing I've seen is a 2. Best thing I've seen is a 3, 4, 5, etc. It's just, if N or D or whatever is the last element, you don't need a state to say the best thing I've seen is an N or a D because you just pick it. So what are we going to do? We got a state says best thing I've seen is a 1, or I haven't seen anything yet. Best thing I've seen is a 2, or I haven't seen anything yet. Best thing I've seen is 3, or I haven't seen anything yet. And suppose 4 is the best. If you ever see a 4, you just go straight to the stop state and you pick it. You ever see a 3, you go to the best thing I've seen is a 3 state. You ever see a 2? Well, if you're not at least in the 2 state, you go there. But if you're, you're up here, you don't go back. You ever see a 1? I guess probably should have drawn this, you just go back. And the choice function's beneath. If you're forced to make a choice, the best thing you've seen is a 1. Well, if you're looking at a 1, pick it. If you're looking at something better than a 1, pick it. Best thing you've seen is a 2, then pick the 2 unless you're looking at something better, and then pick it. Best thing you've seen is a 3, so pick the 3, unless you see a 4 and pick it. But this is only for forced choice. If you ever see a 4, you're going to stop and halt. This is a lot of states, and we can prove it's minimal. So we've got a sense in which satisficing is as cheap as you can get state-wise, and maximizing is just about as expensive as you can get state-wise. But we can ask a question, what if we have more than we need to satisfy, but less than we need to maximize? Namely, suppose we can use up to k states, more than 1, but not enough d minus 1 to maximize. What are we going to do here? And this is going to be what starts to get us a trade-off. I'm going to make, I think, some pretty minimal assumptions about how lists are generated. Basically, they're generated randomly, and by randomly, I mean randomly. So they're generated, from some domain of things, call it X, by a process that's stationary. What do I mean, a stationary process? Well, you pick the first element probabilistically by that process. Then you pick the second element probabilistically by that process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Same probability function, there's only 2 constraints. The first is it's got a non-zero probability of picking every element. Non-zero probability because if it has 0 probability of picking something, it's not really in your domain and you should cross it out. And then the process is going to have the same halting probability. So, we draw with probability distribution P. We stop with probability, say, mu is 1/10, and, we just have a 1 element list. Otherwise, we draw another thing, again, with P, stop with probability 0.1, put another thing on the list, another thing on the list. So if we generate lists randomly in this way, we'll get theorem. So just remember, what's our problem? It's a choice design problem. We got lists generated in this way. We want to maximize the expected utility of the list, of the things we're going to choose from lists by designing automaton with up to k states. K not enough to maximize, but more than enough to satisfy. And we can just show that as long as we're in this range, we can't maximize, but we got more than we need to satisfy. That we can do better than satisficing, that actually the optimal thing to do up to isomorphism is k-phase satisficing. So I'll describe it intuitively, then I'll describe it formally, and then I'll give you a diagram. So intuitively, what are we doing? We're stringing together not one satisficer, but k satisficers, and they're getting pickier and pickier and pickier. And we have a learning rule says Sometimes you get a suggestion by a pivotal alternative to become pickier. You take it unless you're already pickier than that, otherwise you don't. And so these are agents who can always become pickier if they get the right suggestion and never become less picky. But, you know, whatever state they're in, they're satisfied with the threshold they've got. And that's basically what's going on. A bit more formally, we have a starting threshold T0. So we start out as, you know, the satisficer will pick anything at least T0. And we want an increasing sequence of thresholds, T0, T1, T2, T3, T4. Let's actually pick options in the domain with utilities T1, T2, T3, T4, you know, et cetera, and that way, you know, CNN A1 says become as picky as T1, CNN A5 says become as picky as A5, and so on and so forth. So these A's, you know, the pivotal alternatives are proposals to become exactly that picky. A CNN A7 says let's become T7 picky unless we're already T higher than 7 picky. Then, okay, you got some states, and the states are just going to tell you what threshold is. So S0 says, you know, you're at the least picky T0 threshold. S5 says you're at the T5 threshold. If K-1 says you're at the K-1 threshold. And choice is satisficing. So I won't tell you the forced choice. It's just kind of a picky technical thing. As long as we're not in one of these special cases, you know, the things that propose you become more picky, you just decide by satisficing. You're in state I, so your threshold is TI. So you're looking at some X, and if it's least as good as TI, you halt and pick it, otherwise you keep going. The only thing is, of course, learning. We picked these A1, A2, A3s to not be chosen in themselves, but to be proposals to become more picky. So AJ says, be at least as picky as TJ. And you do that as long as TJ is pickier than your current TI, and otherwise you say, no, thanks, that's not picky enough, and you keep going. The last way of presenting it is diagrammatically. So yeah, problem with stealing somebody else's diagrams is they use J and I in the different order that you do. I used I first because I comes before J, but that's how we did it. So you're in some state J. You're either looking at a pivotal alternative says, you know, let's get pickier, or not, and you're making a choice. So if you're looking at some X that's not a pivotal alternative, you're in state J, so your threshold's TJ. And if X is not as good as TJ, then you know, you loop back and you look at the next thing in your list. But if X is better than TJ, you stop and you pick it. And then our learning rule, you know, if X is one of the pivotal alternatives, says J isn't picky enough, let's go up to the threshold I. Well, you go up to state that says we now have threshold I, except if threshold I is actually less picky, and then you say, no, thanks, I'll keep my standards where they are, and then that's where we are. No, I'm going to claim that in this range, when you got more states than you need to satisfy, but not enough to maximize, that we have, well, on the one hand, K-phase satisficing is certainly going to violate an independence of irrelevant alternatives constraint. So independence of irrelevant alternatives, I think the most natural way to formulate it here says, if you pick something from a big list L, and it's also in a sublist, you know, that results from deleting some elements, then you'd better be willing to pick it from the sublist because you haven't done anything to make it worse. If anything, you've made it better. Problem is that's not going to be true because, you know, our threshold raising cannot happen when we delete things from lists. Just take a big element, you know, big list, you know, element 1, element 2, element 3, and a small list, chop the first element off. Let the first element X1 be one of those pivotal alternatives that says let's be pickier, but not the others. And let's make X2 be good enough by our initial threshold, but not good enough by our newly picky post X1 threshold. And make X3 super good, so we're going to pick it if we get to it. Going through the big list, what happens? We see X1, we raise our standards. Raise standard says X2 not good enough, so we go to X3. Make a forced choice between X1 and X3. That's how K-phase satisficing is. They do it. X3 is great, so we pick X3. Independence of relevant alternatives says we'd better pick X3 from a sublist, but we don't because we get to X2, our threshold has not been raised. Now we think, great, X2 is above the threshold, and we never even see X3, we just pick X2. So we've got an independence of relevant alternatives constraint. And we can have lots of other constraints. We can have primacy effects. If you push something forward in a list, it gets more likely to be chosen. That's how X2 lucked out. Recency effects, something seen more recently can be chosen, although that's only in the last element of the list. Get a choice overload effect, and at least in a sense, putting more things on your list can decrease the utility of the choice, even in expectation. Now, really to pin this down, and maybe I'm being too picky, but I like this result because it's really something you can't squirm out of. You might say, okay, David, let's look at some alternatives to K-phase satisficing and see if these are going to have better ordering processes. But the short answer is, if you can't spare the expense of utility maximizing, you're going to get these kinds of results, at least in some strength. So just think about order independence. The choice function's order independent if it's not changed when you permute the list before feeding it in. And two-wise or pairwise order independent if at least on lists of size 2, if you swap them around, you don't change your choice. Likewise, repetition independence, you got a list, you take something for the list, you preface it, you write an extra copy of it first or an extra copy of it last. That's a repetition. A repetition independent choice function doesn't care about the repetition, it makes the same choice. And in pairwise repetition independent, or two-wise repetition independent function just does this for lists of size 2 or smaller. Okay, quick theorem. If you want order independence, even for pairs, or repetition independence, even for pairs, you need at least as many states as utility maximization. So really, if you're not paying for utility maximization, you're not even getting the two-wise versions of these properties. And if you want the full, not just the two-wise versions of these properties, and you're not utility maximizing, you actually need more states than utility maximizing. So these kinds of incoherence results are not things we can squirm out of entirely within our complexity constraint. All right, back to the main thread. So we've got a complexity constraint K, more than satisficing, less than maximizing. Got two feasible processes. You can use one, K equals 1 satisficing. You'll have independence of irrelevant alternatives. You'll have less complexity. Be more complex. You can string together K satisficers, but you'll lose the independence of relevant alternatives. So here you got a trade between complexity and coherence. And, I don't want to preach here, but you might want to accept a little more risk of incoherence here. Why might you want to accept a risk of incoherence here? Well, I just proved or cited a proof that you'll maximize expected utility by doing this. All right, so the story here was about states. You have one state you can't respond in state-dependent ways, and that won't get you incoherence. You got many states you can respond in state-dependent ways, so shifting your state can get you incoherence with what you did in the previous state. I think actually we should talk not about states, but maybe about the learning mechanism that's taking us through states. So what does satisficing do just in plain English? You got a threshold in some features, one or more things, and you say, I'm going to search through options one at a time, car 1, car 2, car 3. As soon as I find an option, say car that meets all my requirements, I stop choice and I choose that car. Otherwise, I keep going. Satisficing is sometimes a good idea, but major known problem with satisficing, you don't learn. You see car 1, you don't change your threshold. Car 2, you don't change your threshold. Car 3, you don't change your threshold. That's a bad idea. You might be seeing a lot of things that are way out of budget. You want to raise your budget constraint, or you might want to, otherwise change your thresholds based on your experience. And so, Reinhard Selten, Nobel-winning economist, says, okay, let's do that. Let's adapt or learn our thresholds, our aspirations in various ways. This is what K-phase satisficing has done, right? You're adapting, you're becoming more picky. You're not ever becoming less picky, but it's a way of adapting. And this kind of adapting is giving you incoherence. And you can actually show for just about every theory of aspiration adaptation that exists, you're going to have the risk of incoherence, right? When you shift your threshold, you can do things that if your threshold hadn't shifted, you wouldn't do. And so things like deleting elements from lists are totally going to give you a risk of incoherence. And so maybe one way of putting what's going on is you got to decide, am I going to use no learning, which is, garden variety satisficing, or some learning, namely satisficing plus aspiration adaptation. You learn, you get more complex, but you have a slightly higher risk of incoherence. And so I think that's maybe what's driving the specific incoherence risk here. And crucially, that's not such a bad thing. I think obviously fully coherent Bayesian learning is great, but if you can't do it, some learning is often better than no learning. All right, so that's a second way to get a complexity coherence trade-off. The last way is going to take some doing. So it's been a major theme of research in the cognitive sciences for the past, say, 20 years, that there's two different ways in which we can give people information, and that the way in which we give people information can really matter. On the one hand, I can give you information by description. So I can say, well, there's this, disease, and 18% of the population has it, and this test has, a false negative rate of this and a false positive rate of this, and my head's already swimming, and I'm probably going to do something silly. It can also just let you experience the information. You're a physician, you're doing rounds, you get a good sense of who has a disease and who doesn't, what treatments work and who don't. And what emerges here is a description experience gap, that when people get information by experience, just interacting naturally with the world rather than having the world described to them, they tend to respond in more coherent ways. This is a big deal for many reasons, including because lately we've had paradigm shift. People have started using descriptive tasks where they used to give agents the same information by experience, and they said, wow, now all of a sudden people are responding less coherently. But, it's important to note that we've changed the task. This isn't the only reason we saw this result at the beginning of the paper, that, non-human animals tend to be more coherent than humans, but it's one reason that non-human animals tend to be more coherent than humans, is because with very slim arguable exceptions, in animal studies, we give animals experience of information, whereas in the same study, we might describe the information to humans. And so humans are confronting the same task and performing less coherently, but of course, they're not really confronting the same task because the information is presented in a more difficult format. More generally, I think for our purposes today, the suggestion here is to think about being an agent. I can use or not use descriptive information that's available to me. And the question whether to use it or not to use it is often going to give us a trade-off between complexity and coherence. So why is it going to give us a trade-off? Well, if you use descriptive information, you're going to be less coherent in your responding very often. That's just the descriptive experience gap. But on the other hand, if you use descriptive information, that's a more complex kind of information. It especially opens up much more complex ways of responding. So here you've got, increasing coherence leading to decreased, increasing complexity leading to decreased coherence. I want to focus here on complexity of information, the ways in which descriptive information might be more complex than experiential information. Again, you could probably catch this out in other terms. And I want to illustrate this by thinking about a specific kind of framing effect, namely attribute framing. So a pretty common finding is that if you ask people about 80% lean ground beef, they say it tastes good, I like it, I'm willing to pay a lot of money for it. You ask them about 20% fat ground beef, they say I don't like it, it tastes bad, I don't want to pay for it. Same thing for like an 80% chance of a gain versus a 20% chance of a loss. This is attribute framing, and of course it's something strange is going on because 80% lean and 20% fat ground beef are demonstrably the same thing. A bit more carefully, in attribute framing, we're fixing, well, first the target entity, the thing we're talking about, ground beef or a gain. And we're fixing an attribute of the thing. We're fixing its fat content. And we're fixing the amount or the measure of the attribute, 20% fat We can describe it as 80% lean, 20% fat, but you know the amount of fat we're fixing. What we're varying is the semantic valence by which we present the measure of the attribute of the target entity, right? We're saying, on the one hand, it's 80% lean and 20% fat, 80% lean, positive valence, 20% fat, negative valence. And we're getting agents responding to valence in their processing. Most people have been pretty down on attribute framing. So here's Jose Bermudez, has probably the most sympathetic book-length treatment of framing in philosophy. He thinks, some framing effects are rational, but he just throws the attribute framing under the bus. He says, well, let me just summarize instead of read this. Once somebody realizes that 80% lean and 20% fat ground beef are the same, they will and should be indifferent between them. That's fair enough. Why will they do that? Well, Bermuda says they must have realized that it was irrational not to be indifferent between them. And so, attribute framing is irrational. I'm not so sure about that. And the reason I'm not so sure is to think about why attribute framing works. And it works for a couple of reasons, but I think the leading explanation of many cases is that we have a valence consistent shift, well, certainly in judgment, right? The framing effect just is that if something is described positively, we like it. And if it's described negatively, we don't. But the judgment shift comes from a processing shift. Namely, positive valence is treated as a cue and attention. We attend more to good things. Memory, we search for good things. Reasoning, we try to find good things about it. And, if I gave you a negative valence, you would just replace good for bad and all of that. Not a crazy thing to do. If valence has some evidentiary value, maybe it's leading you where you should think. This could be useful information about how to process. And so I want to suggest here that we have a complexity-coherence trade-off triggered by the decision of whether or not to use this valenced information, at least in some cases. So, okay, I've given you not only a brute item of information, but also a valence. You can ignore the valence, or you can use the valence. If you use the valence, you're becoming more complex, right? Because valenced information is quite complex. But you're also becoming slightly less incoherent because you're opening yourself up to some framing interventions that can't be done if you don't use valenced information. Quick illustration of how this can happen. So just imagine you're at the checkout line and they've got all those candy bars and you're stuck looking at the candy bars for a couple minutes. Let's imagine the value of a candy bar is summative in quality Q and healthiness H. And they cost $1. Let's, put the cost at 1. Let's use normal distributions for quality. Let's make quality normally distributed, mean 0, variance 3. And healthiness, let's say either something's like not so bad for me is counted as a 0, or bad for me is counted as -2. And let's go Bernoulli. Let's make it a 50-50 between them. So how do I pick whether or not to buy a candy bar? Well, I look at the shelf. I'm just glancing, so I don't observe the quality, but I get kind of a noisy indication of the quality from glancing. And the noise is, not quite as spread out as quality, but pretty spread out. Let's make it normal 0 too. So one thing I could do is just ignore, valence or descriptions or any kind of valence information. Just use the quality signal I get from perusing the shelf. And if you do that, you can show the optimal policies to pick something if the quality signal is at least 26/9 utils. And average utility I get from this policy is a point of 605. It's not so bad. But imagine the candy bars also come labeled, and the labels have some reliability in indicating health. Not perfect, namely 75% reliability. So if it's got a lean label, 75% of the time, that means it's healthy. And if it doesn't, 20% of the 5% of the time, it's healthy. But sometimes they're going to trick me, right? They're going to put like leaner than a king size Twix as one of the trick cases. So we've only got 75% reliability from this valence information. Label method says, okay, I'm going to take the quality signal I observe, thanks, but this label information, it's valenced, it could be misleading, but just the valence of the label is actually useful information, and so I'm going to combine these. And you can prove here, if you combine both of these, the optimal policy is to be quite picky if you don't have a lean label, but if the label says lean, even unfortunately leaner than a king-size Twix, you're going to be much less picky before you buy it. And you're going to have an increase in the average utility of your choice. And in fact, that's a pretty big increase. You're going 20%, 7% of the way to the utility you'd get if you were fully omniscient about Q and H. So, I think that there are some good reasons to think about the valence of descriptions in the candy bar, even if you can be attribute framed. Good reason, you have a utility bump. Downside, you have a coherence decrease. And nevertheless, this might be the kind of trade-off between complexity and coherence that you want to take. Okay, I know this is a long paper, so I don't want to go on for too long. Just brief summary and then some implications. So the paper said, look, there's not always, but often going to be a trade-off in cognition between complexity and coherence. Between the complexity and coherence of what? Well, the complexity of a process and the expected coherence of the attitudes it produces. And we saw 3 ways it can happen. We said procedural complexity, if you just add more and more complex steps, that gives you more room for a clash between steps. State complexity, we said, if you're responding in state contingent ways, the fewer states you have, the fewer opportunities you have to respond in different ways. But maybe we want to talk not about the states, but the learning mechanism that brings us between the states as the culprit. And again, not such a bad thing. I'd rather learn imperfectly than not learn. And also we thought about information complexity. We talked in particular about semantic valence as something that decreases coherence. It makes you frameable, but nevertheless can give you useful information and a utility bump. So this is a kind of increased complexity relying on valence that gives you decreased coherence and expectation. Why would you care? I guess it depends who you are and what you value. One thing you might want to do is just think normatively about how we should confront a trade-off like this. I don't want to say we should never I don't want to say we should never be coherent instead of complex. Certainly, if you think there's just a kind of rationality called structural rationality that requires us to be coherent, then, in that sense, we should always be coherent. But even if non-incoherence has practical costs, when I buy that thing because it said 40% leaner than a, king-size Twix, I've been tricked, I spent money, I got fat. So, there are real costs to incoherence that I don't want to deny. Nevertheless, there can be benefits to complexity. So you don't always gain utility from being frameable, but in expectation, we saw you might. Same with independence of the relevant alternatives. And, that might be a time when you want to be more complex, even if you lose coherence, because you don't pay enough to offset the gains. And complex cognition is the reason that we, and not monkeys and not pigeons, control the planet, go to space, can be speaking on video right now, can do philosophy, can read, can write. So anyone who says that you should never opt for complex cognition over simpler cognition is going a little bit too far. So the thought is that there's a normative trade-off here. Sometimes we want more coherence, sometimes we want more complexity. If you like normative accounts of coherence and rationality, you might be in trouble here. So in the unbounded case, you just say rational agents should be fully coherent. And that's fine because most theories of rational belief and action that have nothing to do with coherence will just entail it as, at least an epiphenomenon. You might be an evidentialist about rational belief, and you might just think evidentially supported beliefs have to be coherent and, coherence will fall off for free. But when you go to bounded rationality, it's not free. So they're going to say rational agents should try to be as coherent, not fully coherent, but at least as coherent as they can, given the kinds of limitations they have. But when it's not free, we got to think about trade-offs. Namely, we got coherence here, complexity here. Coherence theories of rationality say, no matter what you get from complexity, no matter how badly you sacrifice complexity to get coherence, always trade off fully in favor of coherence. And that's a very, very, very strange way to confront this trade-off. It tells you to be more like an earthworm, more like a dog, and less like a human. If anything, you probably want to be a little further towards this side of the trade-off. Thinking about heuristics. So I like heuristics. They're fast, they're frugal, they're high quality if you use the right ones. they have a problem, a very familiar problem. They all have biases, as Kahneman would put it, i.e. there are situations in which they're predictably incoherent. Now, there are lots of things to say about that, they're fast, they're frugal, and so on. But one thing we need to say is talk about the alternative. From the fact that heuristics are incoherent, it does not follow that if we used more complex, maybe system 2 processes, we'd get more rather than less coherent. The argument of this paper is we'd probably have the opposite, and that's why humans are the least coherent creatures on Earth. So even if you like coherent standards for bounded rationality, even just a concern for coherence might actually push you towards heuristics as much as it pushes you away from them. And finally, let's think a little bit about dual process theory. So dual process theorists are going to give you, a lot of different ways of picking out the two processes they care about, but roughly they're going to say there's, one kind of system that's old, it's fast, it's simple, it's heuristic, it's irrational, it's biased, it's associative, and system 2 is exactly the opposite. It's new, slow, complex, coherent, unbiased, reflexive, and so on. Now, what we like to do in the bounded rationality camp is pick at these dichotomies. So think about like associative versus rule-based is how they used to write this. And of course, we say, well, heuristics are rule-based. I can write down the rules. I can give you purely mathematical descriptions of the rules. Why are we saying these are associative? So you might say, okay, associative versus rule-based is not really what we meant, but keep all the other distinctions. Lately, Wim Diniz and collaborators said even like the fast-slow dichotomy is supposed to be the defining dichotomy here, but we actually have quite systematic and widespread cases in which the fast-slow dichotomy really doesn't track what system 1, system 2 is supposed to track. So the fast logic program says, look, a lot of system 1 processes, a lot of system 2 processes are fast, a lot of system 1 processes are slow, and maybe slower than the system 2 processes. And so we're really going to have trouble hanging on to even this fast-slow dichotomy. At a certain point, you might say that scuttles the two-system theory. That's not what Wim Diniz says. Wim Diniz says, let's just cross that dichotomy off the list too and keep the rest. But now we're going after this one. System 1 is supposed to be what makes you less coherent, and system 2 is supposed to be what makes you more coherent. And as far as that's supposed to track simple versus complex, I think we've just got, we got to swap one of these things around. And so, of course, we can keep crossing items off the list and say we're wrong about that. We reformulate this. This is how we do theorizing. But there's a certain point at which we might want to ask whether we have the right stories. So I think definitely challenges to dual process theorizing about cognition are going to be stronger. Okay, so I talk more in the full paper about some normative and descriptive implications of the complexity-coherence trade-off, but maybe we should stop there with enough implications to generate some discussion.